I'd like to call the hearing to order this afternoon, and certainly want to thank our panel of witnesses. We look forward to your testimony and your insights, and also will appreciate the opportunity to ask you questions after you finish your opening statement. Today's hearing is entitled 21st Century Energy Markets, How the Changing Dynamics of World Energy Markets Impact Our Economy and Energy Security. And I'd like to recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. When it comes to energy markets, the transformation over the last decade has been dramatic. In fact, several long-standing energy trends have completely reversed themselves. America has gone from declining oil and natural gas production to unprecedented increases that now make us the world's largest energy producer and a potential exporter. As a result, fears about rising import dependence and skyrocketing energy prices have been replaced with surging domestic supplies that are driving down prices so low, in fact, that they're now discouraging additional drilling in the U.S. The downstream changes have been every bit as dramatic. Domestic refineries, a number of which were optimized to handle imported crude, now have the option of transitioning to use more North American oil. And for manufacturers, the offshoring trend has stalled, and in fact, some of the manufacturing capacity that has been forced overseas by competitive pressures is now returning to America because of low energy prices. And North America's new energy supplies have necessitated a major infrastructure build-out in order to deliver this energy to the consumers and businesses that need it. The changes also have significant geopolitical implications. Many of our energy importing allies were resigned to growing dependence on OPEC and other unfriendly exporters like Russia, but now they see America as a potential new source of reliable and affordable energy supplies. As a result, America has the opportunity to influence the geopolitical situation of these countries that used to dominate global energy markets and exert our own influence instead. There's no question that the America's oil and natural gas boom has been very good news for America, but that is not to say that it doesn't bring new concerns. We have simply traded one set of challenges for another. Unfortunately, our energy policy is largely based on old laws rooted in assumptions of scarcity and may no longer be up to the task of addressing these new challenges and taking full advantage of emerging opportunities. So with these changing times, we think it's essential that we have visit these laws, look at new opportunities, and whether or not it's in the best interest of America to bring about these changes or not. So today we're going to continue that discussion by exploring current and evolving energy markets. We hope to be able to better assess where we are and what new policies may be needed. Our existing energy policy was not created overnight, nor will any changes to it happen overnight. This will be a thorough and deliberative process, and one in which all affected parties will be heard. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, I want to thank the Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush for holding this hearing. Oil markets are changing rapidly. We have reduced oil and gasoline prices, increased domestic oil production. At the same time, we've seen oil price plummet from $100 a barrel to under $50 a barrel. And this has led to great savings for the American consumers. But we've learned in California that prices at the pump don't always track the price of crude. For example, in my state, we've seen the steepest increase in gasoline prices in history. It went from 20 cents a gallon overnight in San Francisco and Los Angeles last Thursday to Friday. And prices in Sacramento rose over 40 cents per gallon in 1 week. So soaring wholesale gas costs are prompting higher retail prices at service stations, In-state refineries are switching over to pricier seasonal blends, while at the same time, refinery problems have effectively lowered capacity. Given that we are experiencing these spikes at a time the rest of the nation is enjoying lower gasoline prices, I think it's important to mention the dangers of depending on just one source of fuel for our transportation needs. We should consider carefully the potential problems that could arise if we decide to alter our approach to managing crude oil resources. When we talk about exporting crude oil, we are mainly talking about the light, sweet crude that comes from the tight shale formations. To extract this resource requires a tremendous supply of another very precious resource, especially in California, namely water. In my state, in my region, we know all too well how important water conservation is and how dwindling water resources can really harm our economy and our way of life. I'm concerned that until we develop new, more efficient and environmentally protective ways to use and conserve water in hydraulic fracturing, we will be wasting an endangered resource, mainly to ship another resource abroad for the financial gain of a few. I think we need to carefully weigh the safety of our drinking water and irrigation supplies before we begin to extract crude and bypass U.S. refineries in order for producers to obtain slightly higher prices abroad. Low oil prices combined with additional domestic production decreases our reliance on foreign oil, which often comes to us from unstable regions of the world. I believe a major factor in this equation should be on supporting and enhancing our efforts at conservation. And this brings me back to the hazards of being dependent on one source of fuel for our transportation need. It's time we diversify our fuel sources. We've made great strides in improving our fuel economy in the last 5 years. It's time to start improving our fuel options. We should be looking more toward plug-in hybrids, fully electric vehicles, natural gas, and even hydrogen-based transportation. I know that in recent years, a barrel of crude oil produced in the United States has sold for less than a barrel of crude oil in the world market. I'm interested to hear both sides of the debate on how allowing export of U.S. crude will affect both the global and the U.S. oil and gasoline markets. And equally important, how regional markets in the U.S. could be affected. We should also consider whether rushing into short-term production of as much oil as possible is the best strategy for our long-term national security. In the wake of the 1973 oil embargo, we created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve so that in the event of a worldwide unrest, we would have petroleum to continue operating and to protect our national security. We should consider whether our oil fields in North Dakota and Texas might serve a similar purpose in the future. Finally, I want to consider the threat of climate change and how increased production, refining, and export of the new American oil fuels will impact the Earth's future climate. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing the witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Energy markets are changing, and they're changing for the better. America is producing more while using and importing less, and the energy boom is translating into a jobs boom, and that's not a bad thing, not just in energy production, but also energy infrastructure and manufacturing. The combination of increased domestic oil supplies and decreased demand not only strengthens our energy security, but it also presents new opportunities for energy diplomacy. The days of energy exporting aggressors like Russia exerting uncontested geopolitical influence may be numbered now that America is emerging as an energy superpower. And while the overall effects of our domestic energy abundance are overwhelmingly positive, yes, they do create some challenges and complications when viewed under the lens of our existing federal energy policy. For example, the recent drop in oil prices has been great news for consumers in Michigan and across the country who are finally getting a break at the gas pump after several years of prices above $3 and $4 a gallon. But at the same time, current prices pose a challenge for producers, their employees, and their communities in which they live. And in fact, some energy workers have already, thousands of them, have already lost their jobs. Couple these changes with a new global petroleum landscape of enduring complexity and emerging volatility, it only further reinforces the point that the time to examine these issues is now. Clearly, the changes in energy markets affect different parties in different ways, and Congress needs to be aware of all of the impacts before considering any modifications to energy policy. That's why we took a very careful and deliberate approach on the issue of natural gas exports in the last Congress. For more than a year before we proposed legislation to expedite LNG export approvals, we thoroughly studied the potential impacts on natural gas producers and on users like manufacturers and consumers. We acted only after listening to all the interested parties and concluding that LNG exports would be beneficial for the economy and a net jobs creator, and we passed it in a bipartisan way. We also heard from many foreign policy experts and embassy officials about LNG exports and concluded that they promised significant geopolitical benefits, and I would note that with Russia once again threatening to cut off Ukrainian natural gas supplies, I believe that enactment of our LNG bill can't come soon enough. When it comes to revisiting the 40-year-old restrictions on oil exports, we will take the same deliberative approach. We recognize that the export of oil and other liquid hydrocarbons presents different issues than natural gas. That's why we again are undertaking a thorough review and will consider all the perspectives, including producers, refiners, and consumers. That is the purpose of today's hearing and why we are soliciting public comments on changing energy markets. If we choose to change the law on exports of oil and other liquids, it will only happen after an open review of the current policy. Our energy abundance has greatly changed energy markets and presents a wonderful number of new opportunities, and we'll consider carefully our approach to all of them. And I yield to the Chairman Emeritus of the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to compliment you on the statement that you just made. I appreciate what you said about deliberative process and keeping an open mind and having hearings like this so that we can get all the facts. The United States is probably the most blessed nation in the world in terms of energy resources. Some of the people at the table before us have helped to develop those resources. Others have helped to conserve them and make sure that they're produced in an environmentally safe fashion. As we go forward in this Congress, we need to work together, hopefully in a bipartisan fashion, to craft an energy policy that's acceptable to all sides and is acceptable to this great country. We have a tremendous opportunity in the world markets today because of our abundance of energy and the way we're producing it in an environmentally efficient fashion. And I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses, Mr. Chairman. And I'll yield 30 seconds to anybody who, Mr. Flores, if he wants it, or Mr. Johnson. Anybody? Then that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Some of the members are leaving because we do have one vote on the House floor. But before that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, ranking member, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Our energy picture is rapidly evolving. Worldwide crude oil prices are at their lowest level in 5 years. U.S. gas prices have been hovering around $2 per gallon, and domestic oil production has increased dramatically in recent years, while the growth of demand has slowed noticeably. And all this is good news for consumers in the near term. These changes reflect in part the all-of-the-above energy strategy that this administration has pursued, ranging from additional exploration and production of fossil fuels to development of alternative energy sources and increased fuel efficiency standards for our cars and trucks. The administration has also recently taken steps to facilitate the export of liquefied natural gas and other petroleum products. The current low oil prices benefit us all in many ways. Overall, low oil prices increase our GDP and decrease the amount Americans spend on energy, particularly at the pump. EIA projects that U.S. households will spend about $750 less in 2015 than in 2014 and about $450 less in 2016 than in 2014. And the increase in U.S. production is meant to decrease in imported oil with significant geopolitical implications. For the first time in decades, we have some ability to be partial price makers rather than price takers. However, these conditions are but a snapshot in time, and there are many factors that could change the energy picture dramatically in the future. Lower oil prices can impact the economics of additional domestic production. Geopolitical instability can adversely affect our allies and our nation. Crude oil prices can fluctuate based on global and domestic market forces. Although it's possible that we experience sustained low oil prices, it's also possible that oil prices and gasoline prices will rise over time. Last December, this subcommittee held hearings on the decades-old crude oil export ban. I believe it's entirely fair to consider the merits of a policy that was enacted in the wake of the '73 oil embargo. This is a very different world than it was in 1973, but I do not believe a clear picture has yet emerged as to what policies we should pursue. Therefore, while this is a topic worthy of our examination, we need to act carefully and act based on fact. That is the essence of good policy and of regular order, which I will continue to insist on before we take legislative action. Last year, the administration issued guidance that certain petroleum condensates could be exported without the typical restrictions reserved for crude oil exports. While these rulings remain controversial, it's clear that the administration retains the authority to authorize crude oil exports in specific circumstances. And some companies have already started to export petroleum condensates, but the extent of such exports remains uncharted. If we're to consider a more wholesale lifting of the ban on exports, there are numerous questions that need to be answered. First, how would lifting the ban affect the short and long-term price of crude oil and therefore the price of gasoline? I don't believe there's a consensus on that point. Second, how would such a change affect both our refinery capacity and the balance of jobs? Refinery capacity is a critical element of our infrastructure and can be an important source of middle-class jobs. In fact, both parties have long bemoaned the lack of new refineries in this country. How would exporting crude oil instead of refining and exporting finished petroleum products affect potential job growth in the years ahead? Is the rush to export crude oil beneficial to small refineries as well as to large integrated oil companies? And finally, what are the environmental and climate impacts of lifting the export ban? In '73, we did not yet have the Trans-Alaska Pipeline or widespread use of horizontal drilling techniques. We did not have large-scale domestic oil production in North Dakota, and we had not yet tapped into the oil and gas from other shale plays. But we also had not experienced the Exxon Valdez or the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spills. The term fracking was not in the common vernacular. Oil and gas pipelines weren't sprouting up in backyards, parks, and farmland the way they are today. And most importantly, the concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere had not yet topped 400 parts per million. In today's world, it's no longer wise to consider energy policy as distinct from environmental policy. They are linked, each is a facet of the other. Increasing crude oil exports means increasing domestic production of crude oil with attendant impacts on climate change, on public and worker safety, on property owners, and on protection of our above and below groundwater supplies. Too often we eagerly embrace short-term profits and benefits without understanding the costs of our actions. We should not make such a mistake again here. Instead, we should take the long view to ensure we fully understand the enduring consequences of our actions and choose the cleanest and most sustainable path forward. And that's the essence of common sense energy policy. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, I guess, when we return from the vote. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Pallone, thank you very much. And I want to apologize to our panel of witnesses once again. We think we only have one vote. There may be a second vote, but we have a 5-star cafeteria downstairs, and it's open until 2:30. But we hope to be back here by 15 or 20 after 2 at the latest. So thank you all for your patience, and we'll look forward to your testimony as soon as we come back. So we will. Yeah, well, they told me to tell you to stay close, so don't go too far. So we'll adjourn until that time.
That was easy. Thanks. Thanks. I'll put that right there.
Yeah.
He played some racquetball.
Call the hearing back to order. Rather than introduce all the witnesses at once, I'm going to simply introduce you and then recognize you for your opening statement. But our first witness will be Adam Szymanski, who's the administrator, United States Energy Information Administration, certainly no stranger to testifying for the Energy and Commerce Committee. So, Mr. Sminsky, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Mr. McNerney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to address changing dynamics in the world energy markets. The Energy Information Administration is a statistical and analytical agency within the Department of Energy. By law, EIA's data analyses are independent of approval by any other federal office or employee, so the views expressed here today should not be construed as representing those of the Department of Energy or any other federal agency. My testimony focuses on EIA's oil market outlook and its economic implications, and it draws heavily on our short-term energy outlook. I want to talk a little bit about prices, demand, and the overall outlook. Since the middle of last year, the global supply of oil has exceeded global consumption, leading to growth in oil inventories and a major decline in prices. In January, the monthly average price for West Texas Intermediate crude was $47 a barrel. That was kind of down towards the bottom, or at least the most recent bottom, down from an average of $106 a barrel in June of 2014. Prices turned up in February, with WTI, West Texas Intermediate, and Brent respectively averaging $51 and $58 a barrel. The recent rise likely reflects some optimism regarding the pace of market rebalancing, including lower rig counts, drilling, and capital expenditures on the supply side, and some positive news on the global economy that impacts demand. Global supply of crude oil and other liquids grew more than 2 million barrels per day in 2014, 75% of that from the United States alone. In 2015 and 2016, EIA sees non-OPEC supply continuing to grow under our price forecast, but more slowly. Lower costs should help support activity in the lower 48-state shale oil plays that have contributed to the majority of the recent U.S. production growth. The trend of slow decline in Alaskan production is expected to continue, while federal offshore production, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, where development projects have long lead times, grows due to projects recently brought online and startups that are scheduled for 2015 and 2016. Net in 2016, as we still see U.S. production rising close to the historic high in 1970. EIA expects economic growth to drive a pickup in global consumption through 2016, led by China and the non-OECD Asian countries. Consumption in Japan, Europe, and Russia, on the other hand, is expected to continue to decline. The rest of the OECD countries, led by the United States, is expected to grow modestly, and lower oil prices should add to demand growth. Now, recent prices of futures and options contracts suggest an unusually high level of price uncertainty, with the implied 95% confidence interval for market expectations for WTI prices at the end of this year ranging from $32 to $108 a barrel. Mr. Chairman, I remember back in December when I was here, one of the members said, "That is a really big range you're talking about." And I said, "Yes, it is, and that's what the market is saying. That's what investors are saying." There's a huge amount of uncertainty, and I think during the opening remarks, some of those uncertainties were mentioned. Geopolitical events, what's happening with the economy, and so on. Absent further sanctions or unplanned disruptions, EIA's average price forecast for this year is $55 a barrel, and for next year, about $71 a barrel. Now, there is some good news, and the good news is that consumers are receiving a direct benefit from lower oil prices. U.S. regular gasoline retail prices, which were $3.36 a gallon average in 2014, are now more than $1 below that. The average household is expected to spend $750 less for gasoline this year than in 2014. If that household has more than one vehicle, or if you live in an area where you're on oil heat or propane heat, you'll even be saving more. Mr. Chairman, I want to take the last few seconds and just mention some of the things that we're doing at EIA that I know members here of this committee have been very interested in. EIA has undertaken a huge effort to improve the quality and timeliness of our data and analyses. We just launched a monthly survey to improve estimates of both the volume and quality of oil production. That should help with this question of oil exports. Related to which, we are working with the producing states through the Groundwater Protection Council, which is developing a national database of well-level data. Next month, the EIA plans to begin publishing monthly information on movement of crude oil by rail, another important topic. We've also begun working with our counterparts in Canada and Mexico on validating cross-border flows of energy, improve infrastructure mapping, and energy trade. Recognizing the growing connection between the U.S. and global energy markets, we're redeploying resources to extend our international data and analysis capabilities. And one key focus area is global oil demand growth. That has significant implications for future oil prices and petroleum product and crude oil exports. Another is world supply and demand for natural gas, which we will determine the extent of opportunities for the United States, given everything that's happening with LNG and LNG exports. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify here, and I look forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Szymanski. Our next witness is Mr. Scott Sheffield, who is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Pioneer Natural Resources. And Mr. Sheffield, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and the red lights will come on when the time is up. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Whitfield, Mr. McNerney, and committee members. It's great here being today. I represent Pioneer Natural Resources and its 4,000 employees. We're one of the most active independents in the U.S. I have 40 years experience as a petroleum engineer, 30 years as CEO of this Pioneer. What's interesting today, listening to Netanyahu's speech, what brought home to me is that I was raised in Tehran, Iran. That was the big topic today. I spent over 10 years traveling to Tunisia as we had an office in North Africa. What hasn't changed in the last 40 years, the world is still very dependent upon Middle Eastern and North African crude. What has changed in the U.S. is this piece of rock, which I left one at your table, is that we have actually found 6 world-class oil fields. This represents the Wolfcamp field in West Texas. It's now the U.S. largest oil field that we have found, over 75 billion barrels. We used to get 50 barrels a day out of this. Now we're getting over 2,000 barrels a day out of this rock with new technology. The shale revolution has been a game changer for this country. We now are the largest liquids producer in the world, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia. We've almost doubled production from 5 million barrels a day to 9.3 million barrels a day since 2008. Reduced imports from 60% to 30% in a very short time frame. We've been the largest job creator in the country for over the last 6 years. Also, we've reduced the trade deficit. Our industry, $200 billion annually. A combination of less imports, but we're refining and sending out over 4 million barrels a day of refined products. In addition, 1/3 gasoline that we refine is being exported. This is my 5th downturn in my career since 1981. We've seen over 900 rigs drop from a high of 2,000, almost 50%. We've seen $50 billion of CapEx reductions by the industry over the last 2 months going into 2015. Industry layoffs of over 50,000 workers and continuing, leading to flattening to declining production going into 2016 at current prices. The strategy of OPEC is to preserve and grow market share. I can promise you OPEC loves the export being in place in the U.S. Let me explain how oil is traded and how it works. For my entire career, sweet crude internationally, sweet crude domestically traded at the same price. Over the last 3 years, we've seen a big variance of $10 to $15 per barrel in those prices. Today, it's $11 a barrel in those prices. There's no benefit for consumers. Consumers are paying world gasoline prices. Through studies that Adam has done at EIA and other independent studies, that's been proven that the U.S. consumer is paying a world gasoline price based on international oil prices. Allowing U.S. crude to be sold overseas would increase global supply, causing gasoline prices to decline. So, for instance, if you lifted the ban today, we put 300,000 barrels a day on the market. It would compete with OPEC. It would lower the price of the international crude. The domestic price would move toward it, like it has over the last 30, 40 years. Removing the crude ban allows U.S. producers to compete. Just a $10 swing in price makes a difference of this country growing or declining 2 million barrels a day. A great example, Pioneer was the first company to export processed condensate last summer through a Commerce Department confirmation. We're actually realizing $8 a barrel higher price by exporting to Europe, Japan, South Korea. We're taking that cash flow, drilling more wells, more production, more jobs in this country. With the ban lifted, U.S. remains the largest producer, lowers gasoline costs, adds U.S. jobs, increases government revenues, and what's most important is selling oil to our allies in Europe, Japan, South Korea, reducing their dependence on Iran and Russia. It's important to act now. If you lifted the ban today, I can promise you Pioneer would add more rigs today, more jobs, more U.S. investment. And the other 7,000 independents in this country would do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sheffield. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Charles Drevna, who's the president of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. And welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Mr. McNerney, and members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to provide AFPM's view on trends in today's energy markets. I want to leave you with a couple of key messages today. First, I think we can all agree it's incredible that the U.S. is at a point where we're able to have a real conversation about lifting the crude export ban. Seems like just yesterday when the committee was hearing testimony from a trove of peak oil alarmists, and I was cautioning against market interfering and counterproductive initiatives, including the RFS. Now, 7 years later, over the same time, we are producing more than 70% of our oil, and it's projected to go higher. Imports are down 66% to about 45%, but when you take out Canada and Mexico from that equation, we're down to around 20% of imports. This is nothing but great news for our economy and the consumers. With the noted exception that 7 years later, the assumptions used to promote the RFS have been proven invalid, and the RFS continues to inhibit free markets and consumer choice. Takes me to my second key message. The distribution and refining systems are undergoing significant and rapid changes. These changes are happening for the most part because new production is not connected to the refinery delivery infrastructure that existed prior to the shale oil boom. As a result, upstream producers, midstream distributors, and refiners are rapidly adapting existing infrastructure while investing in new infrastructure, whether by a pipeline or rail. Changing market dynamics have also impacted the economics of many refineries, including those along the East Coast that were literally days away from closure. The ability of these refiners to utilize Bakken crude is a great example of this revitalized energy industry. The refining industry is also undergoing more significant change. The U.S. is home to the largest and most advanced refining complex in the world. That's a fact that should give all concerned with economic growth and national security an enormous amount of comfort. We produce about 20% of the world's fuel, and since 2009, we've been a net exporter of petroleum products. With new domestic supplies coming on, the industry is undergoing even more changes to accommodate this vital resource. Leads me to my third message. You may have been led to erroneously believe that refiners are unable to process the light crude being produced. I am here today to categorically state that the refining industry is well equipped to handle all the increased production expected to come online in the coming years. Refiners already have significantly reduced imports, increased utilization rates, changed their crude mix, and invested in additional refining modifications to utilize more light crude. For example, Turner Mason estimates that if the economics continue to be favorable, an additional 900,000 barrels per day of capacity is possible with existing capacity and the investments already planned. This would ensure refiners have the capacity to use all new crude for at least the next several years. Of course, an adverse regulatory regime and changing market dynamics could render this bright future moot. Whether it's market-distorting legislation and regulations, the manufacturing renaissance destroying ozone NACs, or others in a litany of uneconomic and conflicting regulations, U.S. refiners continually face uncertainty in the way global competition doesn't. As gasoline demand continues to drop in the coming decades, refiners will be increasingly dependent on export markets, which means competing penny by penny, gallon by gallon, with global competitors who are subject to a very separate set of rules. I mention all this to set up my final point, which is that AFPM believes that the right energy policy for America is based in free markets, which lower cost and increase benefits to consumers. As a result, AFPM does not necessarily oppose lifting the crude export ban. However, AFPM strongly believes that a holistic energy policy that addresses other anti-free market policies at the same time is essential. Going back to what Chairman Upton stated, we have to get this thing right in a holistic approach, not do it piecemeal in a vacuum. We've done that for too long in this country on energy policy, such as it is. For instance, with the restrictive Jones Act shipping requirement in place in a world without the crude export ban, it would be cheaper to ship a barrel of crude from Houston to a European refiner than it would be to ship it to the Monroe facility. This makes zero sense. As Congress debates lifting the ban, I urge you not to make the mistakes of the past by narrowly focusing on one issue and leaving it in a wake of unintended consequences in the market. We have time to gather the facts and develop a more holistic approach. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Drevna. Our next witness is John Kingston, who is the president of McGraw-Hill Financial Global Institute. Great to see you again, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Congressman McNerney, and members of the subcommittee, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to share the views of the McGraw-Hill Financial Global Institute. I am the newly appointed president of the Institute. We are McGraw-Hill Financial's thought leadership platform. MHFI provides independent benchmarks, credit ratings, portfolio and enterprise risk solutions, and analytics, and is home to some of the most iconic brands in U.S. finance, economics, and business, including Standard & Poor's Rating Service, S&P Capital IQ, S&P Dow Jones Indices, Platts, and J.D. Power. Prior to being appointed president of the Institute, I spent more than 29 years with Platts, the MHFI brand that provides the energy industry with independent news, analysis, and benchmark price assessments that are used as the basis for billions of dollars in energy commerce throughout the globe. I hope to provide you with helpful insights from all of our brands, as well as additional unique insights from the Institute. Over the last 30 years, oil prices have seen several booms and busts. However, the price slide of recent months is like no other. In 1998-1999, the boom-bust cycle could be attributed mostly to the Asian financial crisis and a collapse in demand from that region. The price collapse of 85-86 bears more resemblance to the current cycle. Key producers like Saudi Arabia were determined to recapture market share against a backdrop of some increases in supply and some cuts in demand. Despite the similarities, the mid-'80s did not feature the enormous North American-generated increases in supply that we are witnessing today. While the Saudis and their Gulf allies are determined to hang on to market share this time, this is not the immediate reason for the price decline. Instead, it is the growing imbalance between supply and demand that finally combined this year to send the market plunging. It would have happened earlier had there not been so much disruption of international supply lines due to various political reasons. Once Libya came back toward 1 million barrels per day in June and July, that tenuous balance could hold no more. It's interesting to note that since that surge out of Libya, that country's output has fallen back significantly, yet the price remains at depressed levels. So while there are global factors contributing to the drop in oil prices, none compare to the scale of what the U.S. shale revolution has done in just a few short years. It's important to note that the amount of capacity in the world that is on the sidelines because of political issues is enormous. One recent estimate put it at about 4.5 million barrels a day. It starts with small countries like South Sudan and Syria, and it rises up to outages close to 1 million barrels a day in Iran due to sanctions and Libya due to civil war. And this does not even take into account where political mismanagement of a country's industry can and sometimes have given it a productive capacity far less than what it should be. Venezuela is obviously in this category. If there was any sort of significant move toward peace in these areas, since the cost of production in most of those regions are all significantly less than the U.S., oil prices would come under even greater pressure. The price slide has raised repeated questions just about how cost competitive the U.S. industry can be in the lower price environment, and also raises the question of the competitiveness of U.S. crude exports should they be allowed. It's safe to assume that some, if not all, refiners around the world probably have some models about how U.S. crudes would perform in their facilities if exports were allowed. The rise in U.S. crude exports to Canada, mostly via rail, indicates that Canadian refiners, at least, are finding U.S. crudes to be attractive. If they weren't, those export numbers would be falling, not rising. So as to how U.S. crudes will do battle in an international market if export bans were lifted, all we can say is we'll see, and I have some numbers to talk about later. I'll now turn my focus to the impact that the current pricing environment is having on U.S. producers. Based on earning calls, MHFI's subsidiary S&P Ratings is seeing a 35% CapEx expenditure cut this year. Those numbers go up to 50% in some cases, down to 10% for the major producers, and many are running capital expenditure budgets that just hold on to maintenance levels. This year, S&P does not expect the price impact on companies to translate to significant debt defaults, although reducing CapEx certainly affects the employment market. The oil and gas sector has been aggressively adding jobs during the economic recovery. During that period, job growth for the oil and gas industry was 39%, as opposed to the 8% growth in the U.S. job market overall. However, the industry showed job losses of 2,000 in January, and regions that are heavily reliant on the energy sector could see a greater negative impact on employment. While the regional impact of oil prices will differ, in the near term, low oil prices are a boon, though, for the overall economy. According to S&P's U.S. economists, savings could tally up to $87.6 billion for the national economy. That's $1,000 for the average household in 2015 alone. Out in the state capitals, operating budgets appear safe in the short term. In the long term, however, given a long-term secular slide in oil prices, states will need to react by altering their fiscal management. No two states are alike, even ones with similarly sized oil-producing industries. Therefore, many questions need to be answered, such as what oil price and production level did the state assume in their budget? I'm glad to provide more information on any of these issues discussed here today or any others offered by MHFI in the question and answer session or at any time in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Kingston. At this time, I recognize Ms. Amy Jaffe, who's the Executive Director of the Energy and Sustainability Program at the University of California, Davis, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Whitfield and Representative McNerney, for this excellent opportunity to address the committee. I look forward to our discussions. I'm going to focus my remarks on the geopolitical aspects of the questions at hand. But before I turn to that, I just wanted to make the point, also in the geopolitical context, that markets react to stimulus. So we had a very high oil price artificially imposed into the market by OPEC. That created opportunities for companies like Mr. Sheffield's companies to pursue unconventional resources, more expensive resources. And as a result, we're having this boom in the United States. Over time, we learned by doing so the cost of producing the expensive oil comes down. That put OPEC back in a bind, right? So they thought they had the upper hand. Russia thought it had the upper hand. Iran thought it had the upper hand. And all of a sudden, the market responded. So now we're at a juncture where Saudi Arabia had an opportunity. The market's responding. They have to come up with a strategy. They have to decide what strategy to come up with. And they have a unique opportunity to row the boat in the same direction as the United States and use a lower oil price to put geopolitical pressure on countries like Russia and Iran to come to the peace table and have negotiations on serious conflicts we're seeing in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I do believe that our allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council had those goals in mind when they set the policy to create a market share war in the market. We now have an opportunity as the United States to leverage that opportunity and to lead from the front. And we know from watching what's happened in the markets when OPEC tried to hold the price up and we have other kinds of barriers into the market, that it's like the little boy with his finger in the dike. You know, you can put your finger in the dike in one place, but if there's pressure from the water, there'll be a crack somewhere else and the water will pour out somewhere else. That's sort of how the export ban is, right? We now have 430 million barrels of oil, close to historic highs, sitting in storage in the U.S. Southwest. At Cushing, Oklahoma alone, we have 49 million barrels. That's near the record high in history in the United States of 42 million barrels, right? So to say that the refining industry feels like over the next 3 years they'll be able to refine those barrels, that doesn't help us now. We have this giant stockpile of oil that's sitting with no place to go. And that is a market inefficiency. And we need to think about the way that markets balance. Refineries have accidents. And when we have a refinery accident, all the crude oil that was going to go through that refinery has to go somewhere else, or it has to sit in storage. You know, we had put the ban in place at a time when there was no futures market, there was no hedging, there was no transparent pricing, right? We're in a totally different market today, and we need to think about the inefficiencies that we create. We are exporting gasoline. The exports of gasoline, and we import gasoline, so we're a major participant in the global market for gasoline. The idea that somehow holding something in, like having our finger in one part of the dike, is going to protect consumers from the global trends in gasoline is ridiculous, because we're both an importer and an exporter, so all our gasoline prices are subject to international market prices. We just had a refinery accident in California. The pressure that puts on the California market comes, and if we're exporting gasoline from California, then that contributes to the supply balance in the state, right? We cannot pretend that exports of gasoline don't affect the price of gasoline, but our crude import costs do. That's sort of a ridiculous way of thinking about a market. So my point to you is, for the United States to hoard our oil, for oil to be trapped now in inventory unnecessarily. I mean, companies are scrambling around trying to find another tank. And we have our U.S. prices are depressed by $10 a barrel compared to the international market. So we really need to think forwardly about whether our export and import policies are consistent with our desire to help our allies, Europe, and in Asia, to be able to remain independent of the energy weapon and the kinds of things we see today in the market coming from Russia and other countries. And we need to reconsider all of our policies for trade and energy in that context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jaffe, very much. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Brad Markle, who's the Executive Director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council.
It's a mouthful.
Welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Mr. McNerney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the AFL-CIO to share its views on the important topic of 21st century energy markets. Growing domestic oil production is providing the United States with significant economic boost and a significant reduction in our dependence on foreign oil. In July 2014, the AFL-CIO Executive Council unanimously passed a policy statement opposing lifting the existing restrictions on crude oil exports, which I referenced in my written statement. Our view is clear. Easing restrictions on crude oil exports threatens the long-run health of the refinery sector and the high-quality jobs it provides. Simply put, if we lift the ban on crude oil exports, we will export both our oil and the jobs and economic activity associated with refining that oil. The threat of these job losses is concentrated in the Gulf of Mexico states. I want to raise a key point, one that I haven't heard discussed. If the export restrictions are lifted, the amount of oil exported will, over time, far exceed the amount needed to balance the current refinery capacity that is optimized for medium and heavy oil. Refinery workers and their communities would be subject to the same offshoring trends that have devastated domestic manufacturing, from textiles to apparel, footwear, autos, steel, electronics, and on and on. And the jobs that could be lost are very good jobs. According to the 2012 economic census, the average job in the refining sector paid over $100,000 per year, supported by over $1.8 million in value added per employee. These are exactly the kind of jobs we should be striving to keep in the United States. Some of these jobs are threatened by the recent Department of Commerce clarification of its policies regarding processed condensate, which may have already effectively breached the export restrictions without a single hearing, public notice, or public comment. It seems clear that lots of very minimally processed oil will be exported. Much of the discussion on oil exports focuses on the mismatch in refinery capacity, and in this static view of the industry, the easiest fix for the problem is to reduce imports of light crude oil and then export any remaining domestic crude oil, light crude, unprocessed. Rather than export domestically produced light crude oil that refineries are not optimized to process, there's another solution, one that emphasizes investment in America and expanding employment opportunity for American workers. In 2014, McKinsey examined the implications of increased domestic production of light, tight oil on refineries under scenarios where the crude oil export ban is not lifted. McKinsey believes that, quote, the continued growth of light, tight oil in North America has the potential to drive a fundamental restructuring of the downstream industry in North America and beyond. Domestic production of oil is projected to remain above 8 million barrels a day through at least 2035. The question is not whether this oil will be produced, but where it will be refined. It should be refined in the U.S. so we can reap the full bounty of jobs, economic activity, and the energy security that our increased production of crude oil makes possible. As the American Petroleum Institute put it in 2011 when making the case for domestic refining, quote, because the refining industry operates on a global basis, America faces the choice of either manufacturing these products at home or importing them from other countries. The position of the AFL-CIO is premised on the belief that in the end, markets win out. Economically exploitable fossil fuels do not stay in the ground. They are produced when the price is high enough. The simple question before us is where do we want oil produced in the United States to be refined and made into products? Would we prefer that billions be invested in the U.S. or overseas? Would we prefer to create management, engineering, craft occupation, and production employment in the U.S. or overseas? For the AFL-CIO, the choice is clear. We are unabashedly for creating as many American jobs as we can from the increased domestic production of oil. That means keeping the current crude oil export restrictions in place, not sending crude oil and the job it creates overseas. Thank you for your time and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Merkel. At this time, I'd like to recognize as our final witness Mr. Graham Burnett, Dr. Graham Burnett, Senior Vice President for Fuel Optimization at Delta Airlines and also Chairman of the Board of Monroe Energy. So, Dr. Burnett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Whitfield, Member McNerney.
Do you have your microphone on?
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, Chairman Whitfield, Member McNerney, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I'd ask that my full remarks be included in the record. I have been involved in the refining industry in locations around the globe for over 30 years. I'm currently the Senior Vice President for Fuel Optimization at Delta Airlines, and in this position I manage Delta's jet fuel supply, as well as serve as Chairman of the Board of Monroe Energy, the company that owns and operates Delta's refinery in Trainer, Pennsylvania. Delta Airlines purchased and restarted the idled Trainer refinery in 2012 in order to manage our largest expense, jet fuel, and has created over 400 jobs. We, like other airlines, participate in oil markets on a daily basis. So we believe that as an end user of crude oil and as a refiner, we are uniquely positioned to comment on the long-standing crude export law. We strongly believe the current law remains a critically important policy that provides significant benefits to American consumers. As a result of increased domestic production, the U.S. is importing less crude, which means that we are already directly impacting the global supply-demand picture without the need for exports, and prices have tumbled as a result. The EIA has projected the average American household will spend about $750 less on gasoline in 2015 compared to the prior year, in addition to equally significant savings on home heating oil. Estimates have suggested that the total windfall to American consumers could top $230 billion in 2015. These savings go straight back into the American consumers' pockets, allowing them to use those savings on goods and services, thus stimulating the economy. On the other hand, the oil and gas production sector is still less than 1% of GDP. Compare that with consumer spending, which is 68.5% of GDP. Current crude oil export policy has broad-based economic value. So the question arises, why would any policymaker want to risk jeopardizing the current consumer benefits we are experiencing and institute a policy that would benefit only a narrow sector of the economy? Oil producers want to export crude to get higher prices. Producers claim that U.S. refineries cannot absorb new U.S. production, and that's simply a myth. Energy experts Baker O'Brien have conclusively demonstrated that the U.S. refining industry has been investing to absorb all the projected increase of domestic production through the end of the decade, resulting in lower fuel prices, creating jobs at home, and increasing energy security. Let's not forget the U.S. continues to import 33% of its crude oil needs from outside of North America. Unlike LNG, there is no real excess requiring export, as it can all be used at home. Should Congress eliminate restrictions on crude oil exports, lawmakers also risk endangering energy security, because repeal of current law would mean refineries in Europe could buy U.S. crude at a lower cost than refineries located on the East Coast. Lower freight rates enable them to refine the crude and send products back to the Northeast at a lower cost, leading to closure of domestic refining capacity. Energy security is not just about producing enough crude oil for the nation's needs. Energy security is about maintaining the domestic refining capability to transform that feedstock into the products we consume here in America. Put simply, lifting the ban will benefit European refinery workers at the expense of thousands of American jobs, while endangering U.S. refining capacity that is critical to our national security. OPEC is a cartel, and the global crude oil market is not a free market. Crude oil price is ultimately controlled by a few oil-producing states. Exporting crude oil will not reduce OPEC's power, which represents about 60% of the total petroleum traded worldwide. Saudi Arabia's decision last year not to cut production and allow prices to crash clearly demonstrates that they are a controlling factor for crude price. Furthermore, it's imperative to remember that public opinion overwhelmingly supports leaving the crude oil export law in place. Polls in New Hampshire and nationwide have shown that large majorities of voters across party lines oppose exporting more U.S. oil to foreign countries. So Delta's position is clear. There is no imperative to lift the ban. If export restrictions are lifted, feedstock costs will rise, U.S. refining capacities will be reduced, jobs will be lost, and the consumer will pay higher prices at the pump. It's better for America to maintain present law and export the refined products. Our nation's economic and security interests are best served by allowing American refiners to add value to crude oil here and become less reliant on foreign crude oil from unstable and unfriendly countries. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before the committee. I look forward to answering any member.
Well, Dr. Burnett, thank you, and thank all of you for your statements. We appreciate it very much. As I said in the beginning, this is sort of an informational type hearing because we want to focus more thoroughly on this issue of the pros and cons of lifting the export of crude oil ban. Let me just ask a generic question here. First of all, how many other countries in the world that produce a significant amount of crude oil prohibit the export of it? Are there some countries that do prohibit the export of their crude oil?
None that I know of, though. Russia will have an export tax that sometimes they will really ratchet up if they want to keep the oil in-house.
So they
will just raise that tax so high that it becomes uneconomic to try to send it anywhere else.
Okay. So I know that we're exporting a significant amount of refined products, gasoline, diesel fuel, condensates, and so forth. And do any of you feel like that because we're doing that, that it's putting pressure or causing gasoline prices to go up? Gasoline prices have been going down, and we are, I guess, exporting a large amount of gasoline products today. And diesel, did you want to make a comment on that?
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I think it's fraught with peril when you start talking about what prices are going to do, whether they're crude oil or product prices. As Mr. Sheffield said, it's based upon, prices are based upon what the international market. What we've been able to show by taking a crude oil product, refining it here in the United States, and exporting it is a couple of things. It shows we're globally competitive. It shows we can keep jobs here and keep those refineries running at optimal levels. And that's the benefit of the exports. Without being able to export finished product, mostly diesel too, and that's, with some gasoline, but mostly diesel. We're able to keep those refineries up and running, and that is a national security thing. But if I may say one other thing, sir, I think what we don't need to have this devolve into is a upstream versus downstream kind of debate. Yeah, we're all in this together. And the only thing that we're asking is that whatever you do, you look at the whole picture, and just not one time, perhaps when there's because of some contango going on in the markets, that we have an overflow of stored crude. So let's take our time, take a breath, and look at this thing going forward, and not just one snapshot in time. Thank you.
I'd like to also address that question. It's obviously a ridiculous thing to say that because we're exporting gasoline, it doesn't affect the price. Obviously, if we banned gasoline exports, we would get gasoline build up in storage, and that would depress the price of gasoline. So I think, and we have a particular problem in the state of California, for example, in different refining areas in the Southwest, maybe there's a little bit more flexibility, but in California, where there aren't a lot of pipelines to bring refined products, whenever we have a refining accident or problem, it immediately hits consumers in the state. And there are difficulties because you can't necessarily be cost effective to bring ships around because of the Jones Act and so forth. Those things actually are affecting California refiners exactly today. And I don't know what the statistics are for how much gasoline is being exported from California, but I can tell you that when Chevron had their Richmond accident and when it caused this sudden burst in gasoline prices that were very difficult for average Californians, the industry was still exporting from California diesel fuel and gasoline. So it is a market, and I think that's sort of what was the point of my remarks, which is that if we're going to talk about a market dynamic, we have to look exactly, I agree with Mr. Drevna, we have to look across the entire market, but it's not clear to me why we would have a restriction on crude oil, but not a restriction on products. I mean, it seems to me either we believe in free trade or we don't believe in free trade, and I'm not sure why we're picking one product over another.
I want to kind of bring those two statements together. Mr. Drevna talked about refineries. They are better off operating at a high level. And then what Amy said was that, yes, if you export, if you stop the exports, you'd have a gigantic buildup of gasoline and it would push the price of gasoline down. The problem is it would also push down the economics of running those refineries. So at a certain point, you can't make the refineries run. So if you have some kind of restriction that floods the market and you don't have demand to meet it, and demand's not going to rise that fast, you're going to have terrible economics and you're going to have refineries start to cut down. This is why we all benefit from letting these refineries run at the highest level they can. If that means that they're going to export some, that's great. You know, in this country, we've had minimal growth in gasoline consumption, minimal growth really in energy consumption, and there have been some year-to-year comparisons where we're down for the year. So the question then becomes, and that I think that's kind of a good thing. I think almost everybody agrees that unless it's being brought about by a a weak economy, that's generally a good thing. It's a function of efficiency, et cetera. So you've got this world-class refining sector. If you want it to run, if you want to create the jobs that the gentleman from the AFL-CIO talks about, let them rip. Let this great refining sector run at a high level, and if that means exports, so be it.
Well, my time has expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for your statements. I appreciate Mr. Drevna's comment about looking at the big picture and taking our time to make the decision correctly to benefit our country the most. I want to sort of paint a broad picture here. For exports, I see, for opening up exports, I see two big benefits. One is geopolitical. We can help, Ukraine and the Baltic countries and a lot of the countries that are having problems because of their suppliers. Another benefit is it's going to create jobs in drilling. It's going to create profits for companies. Those are significant benefits. On the other hand, my concerns are right now the domestic prices are pretty low for natural gas and for petroleum, and that gives our manufacturers a real leg up, and I see a manufacturing renaissance, an opportunity for a manufacturing renaissance in this country. So I don't want to give that away. I mean, we have the potential to create millions of jobs in manufacturing with a current price differential that gives our country an opportunity to create those manufacturing jobs. The other concern I have is environmental, groundwater contamination, a big problem potentially in California where groundwater is so valuable, and also climate change. I mean, encouraging more production, encouraging more consumption is going to create more greenhouse gas. It's going to put us farther down that dangerous path. So that's sort of a broad brush. Does anyone want to comment on my observations there? Mr. Sheffield.
Yes, Mr. McNerney, a couple on the water side. We're having droughts out of West Texas, too, just like California. We started focusing on brackish water zones. We're going below the water table out in West Texas. We found a lot of water that we can use from the brackish standpoint. We've also signed major agreements with the cities of Odessa, and we're working on Midland to use affluent water. Our goal is to use no fresh water after a period of time of about 5 years. On the environmental issues, we are going all out to install vapor recovery units to capture all the methane. We're working with EDF at Fred Krupp. I visit with him all the time in regard to looking at ways to, again, capture all methane at the sites when we frack wells and so on. So the industry is going all out on both methane emissions and also using other sources of water.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think most of the players are willing to go down that path. They're willing to make the extra investment. There may be a couple of bad players out there, and it's going to be up to the way that we regulate that market to make sure that the bad players don't do much damage and hurt the reputation of the industry as a whole. So that's something I hope to work with my colleagues on in the future to make sure that we do that.
I'd like to address the gasoline price. Sure. This is not just theoretical. I mean, we had a Brent WTI spread that, for years and years, WTI was over Brent. And then as the boom got going in the U.S. and crude stocks built up, not just in Cushing but everywhere, that price plummeted. And I think at its widest, WTI was $27 below Brent. There was no evidence at all that lowered the price of gasoline in the U.S. because, as numerous commentators, including the recent Brookings Institute study, have shown, the price of gasoline in the U.S., because the U.S. is a gasoline importer and an exporter, as a result of that, we are tied to the world market. The world market is therefore ultimately tied to the price of Brent crude oil.
So there's no differential between American gas prices and the world gas price?
Ultimately,
there's a differential, but
on a spot wholesale level, I mean, yes, there's a difference, but ultimately, if one gets too cheap to the other, they'll just gather it up and export it to the other place. So they stay within a range. But the crude price, because a lot of that crude was stranded at Cushing, dropped significantly below the price of Brent, and the price of gasoline did not follow. If the case is to be made that keeping a large supply of crude here in the U.S. lowers gasoline prices, it would have happened. It's not just theoretical. We had the experiment. Nobody set out to have the experiment, but we had it. And there was no evidence at all that kept the price of gasoline in check.
Okay, Mr. Markle.
Let me just add one thing about our relationship
with
the
I recognize Mr. Markle first.
Oh, sorry.
So this focus on gas prices is something I wish we could get off the table. It's important. I own 2 SUVs, so I'm very concerned about gas prices. But it's very clear that U.S. gas prices are set internationally based on those spot markets. There's a small swing from market to market, and as the gets too wide, then it closes. And from my point of view, it kind of takes the focus off the jobs and economic angle that I think we're not paying enough attention to. So there's a lot of talk about gasoline prices. To me, the question is settled. U.S. gas prices are set on the international market, and whether we export crude or don't export crude, that's going to be the truth in the future as well.
Okay, I've run out of time.
The chair now recognizes itself for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome to our experts. December 22nd of 1975, Gerald Ford signed the law that created the export ban we're talking about today. To show the change America has happened since that time, that very next day, he signed a bill trying to make our country adopt the metric system of measurement, the metric system. That world's been turned upside down, and our energy world has been turned upside down since that time. We have seen a boom in oil production that means some parts of America are seeing some tremendous benefits. Places like my home state of Texas and North Dakota. Energy means amazing opportunities for these small towns. But we've also seen the impacts on the global economy. Our reliance on foreign oil is slipping away faster and faster and faster, more than we could have ever dreamed 5 years ago. This benefits our trade balance, our energy security, and our economic growth. These are huge benefits, and they're real. Growing supply has slashed the price of oil. That's great for Americans at home because the price is so low at the pump. But for my hometown of Houston, this has meant good people have lost thousands and thousands of good-paying American jobs. It's a simple fact that fewer rigs are working and less money is being invested. Market forces and global politics are hitting my hometown hard. But this town, Washington, is adding to the trouble. In this environment, we should be making it harder to drill. And that's why it's time we fix pipeline permitting. Energy means nothing if we can't get it to the markets. And further, the Endangered Species Act should be a protection, not a weapon. And we should be more open to safe offshore development. And we need to keep our rules on our refineries reasonable. And that's why I'm an outspoken critic of the ethanol mandate. Lastly, today, I agree that it is important to consider the ban on most crude exports. But exporting oil won't be a cure-all. But free trade is very important, and no law should be above scrutiny. And this committee is at a very point in this early conversation. My first question is for every panelist. I hear from the oil producers that their oil is trapped. They say it's unfairly marked down compared to global prices. I hear from refiners who say the opposite. They argue there is plenty of capacity, and they are expanding every day to take more and more American crude. Which statement, one of three, best sums up your views about these two opposing views? Number one, we have enough refinery capacity to absorb light oil. We're there. Number two, we have more light oil than can be refined reasonably or absorbed currently. And number three, we have the right amount of oil and capacity in our refineries, but not enough pipelines to get from A to B. So 3 choices. Mr. Szymanski, you're first, sir. 1, 2, or 3. With some comments if you want to.
Chairman Olson, thank you.
Like the sound of that.
Well, I think your number 3, we don't have enough pipelines. I think that was the case for oil from Cushing, Oklahoma, 3 or 4 years ago, but the infrastructure to bring oil south from Cushing to the Gulf Coast, I think, is now in a lot better shape. So that leaves me with one or two. I would say, sir, that it's a combination. I think that the capacity to refine the crude oil is probably there, but not at an equal price between Brent and WTI. So in other words, if the West Texas Intermediate price is discounted enough, then refiners would be happy to take a lot of it. So
I'm sorry for our time. So 1.5 for you, Mr. Sheffield. 1, 2, or 3, please. I'm pretty sure you're probably going to be A1. You have the capacity.
Yes, I think what we're not hearing from the refiners is the economic penalty. They invested $85 billion to redo their refineries because they all thought light sweet crude was declining and we'd never find it again. It was all going to be heavy crude from Canada, heavy crude from Mexico, heavy crude from Venezuela. They invested $85 billion. So to refine light sweet crude, they have to charge an economic penalty. Secondly, they're keeping the $10. They're not passing on the $5 of it back to the producers to create jobs or $5 back to the American consumer. So I think it's obvious for me. Also, I left out a key point. You brought up pipelines. Is that what's interesting about the law in 1975 is that Canada, I love Canada. We had an office there. Canadian producers, they can use our storage, they can use our refiners, and they can apply for a license to export their crude oil.
And I've used my time as the chairman overly, so I'll yield back the balance of my time and give my time now to Mr. Barton. Or we're going to go in.
Well,
I'm sorry.
You get to come to this.
Oh, Gene, I'm sorry. Mr. Green from Texas recognized.
Well, I think it's appropriate that you have 4 Texans left over while we have that one vote on the House floor. So Congressman Flores and Joe Barton and I want to thank the chair for doing the hearing today and thank our witnesses. We're here to discuss an important issue in the district I represent. Because I have, at any given time, our district lines change in Texas all the time. I've had 5 refineries in my district, from Exxon in Baytown to Valero in the city of Houston. And so this is a balancing act. I'm looking at our refiners now having the best margins that they've had that I can remember. And the price of gas is reasonable, $2.15 a gallon, $2.10 in Houston. But I also have a whole bunch of jobs that come from the Baker Hughes, the Halliburtons, and everyone else who are actually and I understand the problem. We're trying to balance it. We want the refinery margins, but we also want to keep those folks working in the oil patch. And so that's where the balance comes from. And if we can, we'll see how it works. But Mr. Szymanski, Administrator Szymanski, it's good to see you again, and thank you for the good work y'all do. You mentioned that EIA is composing a study that would discuss crude oil in exports. Where are you at on that study?
Congressman, we've got
I'm going to do similar hearing on the Republican.
We've done the study on what drives gasoline prices, and I think you heard a number of people talk about the results of that. Gasoline in the U.S. seems to be set more in the international market rather than elsewhere. We are looking at options for petroleum refineries to process additional light sweet crude oil. We'll have that study out in about a month. We have also a study underway to look at the implications of increased crude oil exports on the refining system in general, and we'll have that out, I think, sometime in April. We also published a oil import tracking tool that makes it easier to see some of the changes that have taken place down in Texas and Louisiana. So I'd say over the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks, we'll have 2 or 3 more big studies out.
Well, Congress doesn't move that fast. I think we'll probably be able to see those studies before they do. Mr. Sheffield, first of all, thank you and Pioneer for some of the things you're doing, because it makes it easier. When I drive through Eagle Ford, I hate to see the flaring for lots of reasons, environmentally, but also I know somebody's not getting paid for that product that they're producing. And we have pipeline issues and transmission issues there. What does the world condensate market look like for U.S. exporters? I know the Department of Commerce is doing that. Is that kind of a safety valve for what we need, because we have a current procedure for exporting condensate? Are we having some success in that?
Yes, we are exporting 20,000 barrels a day now at Pioneer of condensate, and it's going to Japan, South Korea, and Europe. They need it. About 8 weeks ago, there were some articles written about that the market is closed. That's because for a period of about a week, the international oil sweet price and the domestic sweet price narrowed to about $2 for just a period of 2 or 3 days. Yeah. And now it's widened back, and that will allow, most experts are thinking that we can export about 200,000 barrels a day out of the Eagle Ford. Several other companies have been approved to be able to go and export their processed condensate. And so that process will continue, and it helps us for about 6 months on this inventory. So the biggest issue is the sweet crude from the Bakken, sweet crude from Colorado and the Niobrara, and the sweet crude from the Permian Basin.
Okay. How long does it take Department of Commerce to review Pioneer's application to export the condensate? The regulatory delay and the time frame?
Yes, it took a few weeks.
That's amazing.
Yes.
We're waiting for exporting on LNG for years.
Let them review.
Obviously, we were very pleased. So.
Keystone proposal.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I know there was some testimony about, I actually have the 2 of the huge tanks that Keystone's built in Chandlerview, Texas. And you're right about getting the Cushing crude oil down there, but we still need it to come from Canada across the border. But the export numbers you're talking about, 20,000 and up to 200,000, you know, the 5 refineries off and on I've represented because I'm real familiar with them, they all have been retooled in the 90s to do the heavier crude.
Yes.
Venezuela, Mexico. And we don't have small refineries in our area. In fact, all of them have been expanded over the years. We probably have the smallest at about 200,000, 250,000 barrels a day. And I remind people that even from TransCanada, if that's a 750,000 barrel per day, we use over 1 million just in East Harris County to do it. Charlie?
Thanks, Congressman. I'd like to make a comment about the retooling and the billions of dollars that we invested, which is true. But I think there's another myth out there circulating that if the only thing those refiners do is just suck up all the heavy crude and that's all they use. They use a mix, and we're pretty good at what we do. Just like Mr. Sheffield's company is really good at what they do. We have, we use light crude, we use middle grade, and we use heavy, and we can take more light by backing out the middle, backing out some heavy. So it's not one of those all or nothing kind of things. Like I say, we've been doing this for a long time, and we can take the extra crude, and given what Adam Szymanski was talking about, I disagree somewhat that we're okay, we've got some pipelines going and we're good and we can go home. No, we're pretty good. We were pretty good going north and south. We found out that we weren't. We're awful going east and west, and probably always will be awful for a long, at least for a long time.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm out of time, but Ms. Jaffe, it's always good to have you for our committee. I like to have a Texan from out in California.
Gentleman's chair is going to recognize himself for 5 minutes because I actually think it's my turn, so I'm going to do that. We're doing the Pony Express. Yeah, we have a vote on, so we're going to vote coming back and changing the chairmanship. Mr. Szymanski, could you tell the subcommittee how many barrels per day of refined products we export and how many barrels a day of refined products we import?
Well, I could get the exact numbers for you for the record, Congressman, but the total amount of exports is now up to 3.5, 4 million barrels a day of products. And
but is it fair to say we're exporting more than we're importing?
We are a net exporter of products.
Net exporter.
That's correct, by a small amount.
Okay, thank you, sir. So if we were to eliminate the ability to export refined products, that would not be a good thing.
I think Mr. Drevna said that refiners are actually benefiting through capacity, and Mr. Kingston, that having the ability to export products actually allows you to run your domestic refinery system efficiently.
Better, yeah.
Yeah, and that actually works to the advantage.
We're for exports of refined products.
That's correct.
That's correct. Now, Mr. Sheffield, and I mean, y'all know this, but I'm the sponsor of the bill to repeal the ban on crude oil exports. So I'm pro crude oil exports. I think y'all know that, but
yes,
in full disclosure, you testified, Mr. Sheffield, that if all companies, all producers were allowed to either sell in the domestic market or sell in the world market crude oil, that while you would get a slight increase in your price domestically, the overall world price would at least be pressured to go down because you would be competing against the Russians and the OPEC nations in the world market. And since U.S. production is going up, that would overall bring the world price down. Is that, or tend to bring the world price down? Is that correct?
Exactly. Anytime you put more supply in the international market, especially at this point in time, you're going to bring the price of the international price.
It may be counterintuitive to some, but if we allow crude oil exports, at least over time, we're going to stabilize world prices and probably bring them down because we are increasing U.S. domestic crude oil production. Is that correct?
And lower gasoline prices for the American consumer.
Okay. Mr. Drevna, you and I know each other real well. I was very gratified to hear your testimony that you're not your association is not automatically opposed to the ban, to the repeal of the ban on crude oil exports. What would need to be done to expedite that? You had some qualifications, and I just want you to be able to put those on the record.
Absolutely, Congressman. When you look at, as I said earlier, if you look at just exporting crude, lifting the ban on the exports of crude oil in a vacuum, there are a lot of other tangential things that must be looked at. So we don't try to solve one problem, create two or three others. And chief among them is the Jones Act. Now I know everyone's going to say you can't repeal the Jones Act. Well, if you don't, you can't even talk about it. Well, I think it's time we talk.
Well, we can talk about it.
Yeah, in the context of the crude oil, you know, we've had 4 or 5 refineries. Some shut down. We have 3 or 4 or 5 others that were, I mean, days. I'm literally days away from shutting down on the East Coast. Bakken crude, getting that Bakken crude there saved them. So what all I'm saying is, you know, ever since we had this thing in '75 and the Arab oil embargoes, we've been having an energy policy here in the country that sort of goes, it lurches from crisis to crisis, and we never look at anything holistically.
So you just want to look at the whole picture.
Look at the whole picture and see what it does to the total economics. If the price of crude goes up somewhat and it's still okay, fine. But
okay. I've got 30 seconds. I want to go to Dr. Burnett. I'm sorry, not Mr. Burnett. Delta is the Delta Airlines, correct?
Correct.
But you also does the parent company own the Delta refinery, or are you a subsidiary of the?
Yeah, Monroe Energy is a wholly owned subsidiary of Delta.
Okay. Now, does Delta Airlines use the total production of the Delta refinery?
The way it works is that all refineries produce gasoline, diesel, as well as jet fuel. So we use the jet fuel directly into the New York harbor to our airport hubs there.
But some of your refinery capacity results in refined products that you sell to others, and probably some of that's overseas. Now, I don't know that.
No, what we do is we actually swap with Phillips 66 and Trafigura. We swap the gasoline and diesel for jet fuel in other locations. Okay. So we have a virtual jet refinery of about 170,000 barrels a day.
Your refinery would oppose us restricting your refined products to only going to Delta, correct? So I want that on the record. And my time has expired. Ms. McNerney, have you asked questions already?
Yes, I have.
You have. Then we're going to go to, no, sir. I remember that you have to go minority majority. That's all. The chair recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing. It's a great discussion, and of course, a lot of us have been talking about this. And I do believe, and I've mentioned this even in the last couple of Congresses. You put more crude oil on the world market price should go down. Pricing would be from Brent versus a captive West Texas intermediary anymore. I think the political concern is what Mr. Zeminski and I talked about on California prices. If we do this, but then some other variable raises the gasoline prices, not a supply and demand debate, but politically, people are going to say, see what you did. You exported the crude oil and gas prices went out. It's very hard for politicians to be able to, without a 5-second soundbite, to be able to explain the macro and the microeconomic issues that we're involved with. So that's probably why we're not going as fast on this as we're doing with LNG issues, which makes it's an easier argument. I want to talk just quickly because Mr. Drevna opened the discussion on the Jones Act. The Coast Guard Admiral Paul Zukov recently said, and I'll just take one of the quotes, I think at the end of the day it would put our entire U.S. fleet in jeopardy, where our fleet of roughly 80-plus international U.S. flagged vessels will rapidly go to zero. And then there is a time of crisis. Who are we going to charter to carry out our logistics? Very difficult if we don't have U.S. flagged ships. And, we're having this big internal Homeland Security debate right now. I think the bill probably just passed. National security issues. U.S. flagged vessels on our inland waterway systems are as a have to. We're just not going to have, especially in the inland waterway systems, which my district borders the Mississippi, it borders the Ohio, it borders the Wabash. Just the national security implications of that, I think, is difficult to do. So, does anyone disagree with that analysis? Just Charlie?
No, I don't disagree, Congressman. You have to realize that what we're talking about from the refining sector is solely the international fleet. And we're free marketers.
Yeah, but you're talking about maybe Tex from New Orleans or Texas to New England. To the New England coast, right? Saying that's international, but it's really national.
Well, but we have international ships coming in and out of there every day.
But they're not going from U.S. port to U.S. port.
Exactly.
I mean, we so anyway, I think it's a very difficult proposition. Ms. Jaffe, I've been involved. I'm headed to Lithuania next week for the 25th anniversary. I deal with Eastern European issues. That's why the LNG. I'm going to go visit the LNG terminal. Talk through the international security implications for our allies, first of all, who are held hostage by extortionists who are not our friends. And also and so I got confused because in this, we put more competitive crude oil on the market. Was it due to our enemies and their ability to do the things that they're doing? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think you raise a very interesting, important point. All of the oil that has been disrupted recently, Libyan oil, or we now have ISIS attacking near the Kirkuk oil field, when Iraq oil gets disrupted or Libya's oil gets disrupted now, that hurts the supplies going to Europe. That gives Russia a tighter stranglehold on the supplies that they provide to Europe. So our goal as their ally and as a world leader and as a believer in free markets should be not only to make sure that we have enough oil here in the United States, but also that we're leading from the front on making sure that powers like the Russians or Iran are not able to use oil and gas as a geopolitical lever, as a weapon.
And the import terminals in like Europe as a whole, there's more crude oil import locations than what you would have on LNG east to west. Is that safe to say?
I mean, Europe is a market. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the LNG export question, I mean, that seems obvious because we have this fear that the Russians would cut off natural gas supply to Europe. That would be
Not a fear, a truth.
yeah, absolutely. So my point to you is, but on the crude oil side, Europe has actually lost their supplies from Libya. And I think the president a 2 years ago correctly released supplies from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to loosen up the light crude market. At the time we were importing still because we want to help out our allies from Europe and we don't want to see Europe having shortages. So ultimately, we have to concern ourselves. We need to look at if there's a refinery on the east coast of the United States whose economics are questionable. You know, is that how we're going to run our foreign policy? We're going to have our foreign policy be oriented to keep one refinery open in the United States because we have these allies. And during Rita and Katrina, I'll speak as a Texan for a moment, you know, Europe lent us the gasoline that we needed to be able to re-evacuate people and bring them back and forth safely to Texas. You know, and we're now telling them that we don't want to provide them with any supply because there might be a competitive advantage for one refiner. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'd like to respond somewhat to that because supply disruptions in Libya and elsewhere do affect the price of crude oil, but there is plenty of crude oil supply available in the world. That's why we have a low price today. The issue for our friends and allies in Eastern Europe and elsewhere is LNG and product availability, not crude oil.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize who's next over? The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Loebsack's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry that we've had to run back and forth. I think whoever's in charge of this institution wants to make sure we get our 10,000 steps in today. So I really appreciate, and I haven't been able to listen to all the testimony. I apologize, just back and forth, a lot of meetings in the process too. I have a lot of questions on this, as you might imagine. I do want to start out with Ms. Jaffe, if I could. First of all, I got my PhD at UC Davis, so I'm glad you're there. But it was in political science, and it's the West Village. You know, is quite an undertaking, being a net zero energy undertaking, and I commend UC Davis for doing that. And I don't know if you must have some role in that. I know that you're in the Graduate College of Management, but thank you for being here today. And I kind of want to explore, maybe with not just you, this whole geopolitical thing that Congressman Shimkus brought up and others. First of all, which specific countries are we talking about that we can help if we're allowed to do so? Which countries?
Well, I think that ultimately we're in a global market, right? But when we have disruptions, and we're not out of the woods with international disruptions. The militias that are funded by ISIS have made a decision that they are going to try to capture as many oil fields as possible inside Syria and Iraq. You know, the response towards that has been, you know, not 100% effective. We have the civil war in Libya, which is disrupting exports. You could have a civil war, as we know from watching events around the Middle East and in Africa. There's many different places where oil supply can get disrupted.
But what?
And the people that it's hurting that is why the price of Brent crude, which is the global marker,
right,
is now $10 higher
right,
than our prices here in the United States, because those are the countries, Europe, and those are the countries that are losing their supply.
But are we talking about specifically Ukraine, or, I mean, where are we talking about where we can help folks so that they're not being extorted by Russia and whatever, you know, the arguments that are being made on that?
I think it's any country in Europe that has a refinery.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the whole continent, and it also affects availability of supply to Asia as well.
So how does that, I mean, how do we then, practically speaking, put into effect that kind of a policy other than lifting the ban? How does it happen then that we can help those countries? Because we never really hear sort of specifically how that works.
Well, we have several different tools. First of all, we now have this surge in light crude oil production in the United States. We have light crude oil sitting in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. There's
but,
no.
I'm sorry, but I just want to be more specific. Maybe somebody here can be specific. How does that oil then get to where we want it to go? You know, how does that happen if we have a policy that lifts
we have to lift the export ban to
right,
be able to be
that
an effective
enables
player
that to
in the
happen,
global
but
market.
how does it happen specifically?
I'd like to point something out. It is entirely possible that you could lift the export ban and nothing happens.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's an empty gesture.
Right.
I think back to the fight in the late 90s over lifting the ban on exporting Alaskan crude. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of effort put into this Congress to get that to be lifted. BP spent a lot of money. At Platts, we wrote a lot of stories on it, and they lifted it, and they made a lot of effort at selling. And after about 3-4 months, the Asian refiners said, you know what, we don't really like this stuff.
I mean, because things are happening in Ukraine that might not allow for this actually to happen.
But
it depends upon the situation.
But there's really kind of a positive thing to it. Mr. Drebner mentioned Turner Mason before. They're a very highly respected engineering consulting firm, and we have a partnership with them for many years. And every day we publish refinery yields and netbacks and refining margins. And if you look at the domestic crudes, they are consistently the biggest winners in refining margins, and not just because of the low price. Right. So it's entirely possible that the export ban can be lifted, and still the refineries in the U.S., which have certainly a big advantage in transportation costs, and a big advantage in fuel costs because they're using cheap natural gas, cheap burn natural gas to run it as opposed to oil in another part of the world. They're just the winners in this battle. Right. But the fact that the possibility of exporting it is there tends to keep things in check. So the advantages that you would get from, let's say, maybe keeping a lid on the Brent price, which affects gasoline price, that advantage still exists. And meanwhile, the refineries are still operating, so the jobs that the AFL-CIO is concerned about, they still exist too. So the refineries can still win this battle, even if the export ban is...
I will just tell you for the record, the concern I have, and you can say it's irrational, that this is nothing like what it was prior to 1973 and 74, but go back, we had a drain America first policy. We all remember that before the crisis back in the 1970s, the first crisis. And I have a lot of concerns, just for the record, I have a lot of concerns that we not get into a situation like that. I know it's completely different in many ways. We have more sources of oil here domestically and around the world, that sort of thing. We didn't even have North Sea oil back then. But I still have a real concern about that. I just want you folks to be aware of that from a national security perspective. I think we have to be thinking about that. I do want to ask Dr. Drebner or Mr. Drebner and Dr. Burnett, about oil prices going down now, understanding how markets work. Obviously, we know that oil prices aren't going to stay at the current level forever. So what strides is the industry taking towards future energy investments instead of asking for us to lift exports in terms of expanded drilling operations, et cetera? What are you doing to prepare for future spikes? I guess that's the question.
Well, from the refining side, you know, we're continuing to upgrade. We're continuing to for not a technical term, we're continually changing the valves,
right,
and making sure we can use the abundance of supply that we have here in the country today. So that's why I say it. But are we there yet? We're getting there very closely. Again, because of what we talked about earlier. Unfortunately, the midstream distribution center was not built in this country to handle what we have today. It's going to take time for us to get caught up, right, but not that much time. Okay. So, you know, we are putting a lot of money and a lot of effort into upgrading the refineries so they can use the light sweet crude. One last thing I'd mention: we talk about the upstream folks winning, the refining folks winning. This is not a win-lose game. We should be talking about what's best for American and the American consumer, and what's best for energy and national security. Then everybody wins.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Had an equipment malfunction. Chairman Whitfield, thank you for holding today's hearing on this timely issue. Several major studies over the last year, including CBO, Brookings, and Columbia University, all agree on a key issue. American consumers and households will benefit if we repeal the outdated ban on crude oil exports. Some have countered that if we lift the ban, OPEC will simply respond by cutting production to stabilize the price in their favor. I think clearly that most recent actions by OPEC rebut that assertion, and I don't think it's appropriate to try to reassert it at this point in time. Also, we've seen in recent months, OPEC wants to keep market share by maintaining production, even in a low-price environment. and they hope to undercut U.S. shale producers, thereby reducing the incentive to reinvest in the business. The Brookings Institution, along with respected economic consulting firm NARA, looked at different OPEC scenarios, cuts in production and maintaining current production levels, and here's what they concluded. The benefits of lifting the ban depend on the energy market conditions and how other oil suppliers, especially OPEC, respond. And then they go on and say the key phrase they said is, what is most important is our finding that in all of these modeling scenarios, there are positive gains for U.S. households. And so the shale revolution in the United States has fundamentally altered the global energy picture, and I think we owe it to hardworking American families and the consumers to facilitate the continuing improvements that we're seeing in this market. Columbia University also reached a similar conclusion, stating while in the past market observers have generally assumed OPEC will offset a large share of non-OPEC production to defend prices, current OPEC behavior in response to the U.S. shale boom cast doubts on the cartel's ability or desire to offset non-OPEC supply. And Mr. Sheffield, like you, I went through 5 of these downturns. I had counted 4, but you're right. I recounted after you said 5. It is 5. Mr. Kingston, my first question is for you. What is your view of OPEC's potential reaction if we were to lift the ban on crude exports?
Well, I think you said it in your answer. OPEC is certainly not going to change its policy now, which is to hold on to market share just because the export ban is lifted. Particularly, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think you can necessarily count on how much oil is going to go out the door. I think certainly, as Mr. Sheffield pointed out, the light condensate doesn't have a great market in the U.S., so that would continue to flow, but that doesn't look like that needs a change. The Commerce Department has clarified that. So if you're talking about crude out of the Gulf Coast or whatever, how much would OPEC cut? It doesn't change really the global supply-demand balance.
Thank you. And I'd try to keep your answers short because I have several questions for each of you. Would you agree that opening new markets for U.S. oil producers will be good for both the U.S. and our allies, regardless of what OPEC does? I think you answered that affirmatively. So, yes,
I'd agree with that.
Mr. Burnett, given that the U.S. shale revolution and OPEC's recent response to keep market share, on what basis can you assert unequivocally that OPEC will respond by cutting production if U.S. crude oil can be bought and sold in the global marketplace?
Historically, Saudi Arabia and OPEC have cut production to maintain market prices.
But they haven't this time. Let me move on to the next question. You make more products than just jet fuel, right?
Yes.
You refine the full distillation scheme. So do you export any jet fuel?
We do not export jet fuel.
Okay. Do you export any other refined products?
We occasionally export some diesel and some gasoline.
Okay. Would it be appropriate
it's mostly swapped for jet fuel in other locations?
Would it be appropriate to stop you from exporting those other refined products?
I'm sorry?
Would it be appropriate to stop you from exporting any of those other refined products?
Of course not.
Okay.
It's a free market. Products are in a free market.
If we said that you could no longer sell those refined products and you were forced to sell them only in the U.S., what would happen to pump prices?
What would happen if refineries were not allowed to export gasoline or diesel is that you would start cutting back refineries and closing refineries.
Okay, Mr. Sheffield, that's perfect. That goes right to where I want you to go. Mr. Sheffield, if we keep the ban on crude oil and keep prices depressed, what does that do to reinvestment in the upstream industry?
I think you'll see the drop of 900 rigs go to a drop of another 1,000 rigs. It'll lead to significantly declining production. And this country will be importing 60%, 70%, 80% of our oil from the Middle East.
And so, Ms. Jaffe, if that happens, who gets hurt?
All I can say, sir, is I'm in the same direction as you. In either case, when you ban and try to do something to twist the market around, the consumer is the one that gets hurt.
That's exactly where I'm going. So does anybody disagree with me that if you put, well, I'm out of time, if you put artificial constraints on the market of any kind, whether it's upstream, downstream, midstream, or anywhere else, you hurt the American consumer and hardworking families who have been crushed under this economy for the last 6 years? Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think there's any doubt that there are competing private interests at stake as we attempt to answer the question of whether or to what extent we should allow exports of domestically produced crude oil. The real question is whether it is in the national interest and the public interest, for that matter, to do so. Even with new drilling technologies, the United States has lower proven reserves and higher production costs than many other oil-producing countries, and we still use a lot of petroleum products. Mr. Szymanski indicates in his testimony that, and I quote, the implied 95% confidence interval for West Texas Intermediate crude oil calculated for the current short-term energy outlook ranges between $32 per barrel and to $108 per barrel. Now, there's no insult intended here for the Energy Information Agency. That doesn't seem very helpful. Basically, EIA is saying that we have no idea what the price per barrel is going to be. So, Dr. Burnett and Mr. Drevna, how do you or your member companies make investment decisions in the face of this price volatility? Does the price matter less than other factors? Perhaps is demand for specific refined products the controlling dynamic? Just how do you make those decisions?
So you make them on what you think the demand is going to be. The refiners are somewhat different than our friends and colleagues in the upstream segment. We operate on demand. You know, whether the price of crude is here or somewhere in the middle, it's all it's going to depend on what the demand is and what we see that demand. As Mr. Szymanski would tell you, since a theory back in 2007 when we connected two dots and drew the demand through the roof, that has collapsed over the years. So we've had to scramble. We've had to do some different things. So it all depends on what we call that spread. So we make decisions based on what we think the demand's going to be, what we think the regulations are or what they are, and what we can do to adjust that spread to A, provide the product, B, pay our employees, C, keep the equipment going, and B, make a profit.
Thank you. Dr. Burnett.
Yeah. What we do is we look at the fundamental supply-demand balance to set what we expect the crude oil price to be over a longer term. Refinery investments are done over many years, so we have to try and take a forward position on what the crude oil price is going to be based on fundamentals. And then, as Mr. Drevna said, look at the demand side of products and try to get an estimate of what those differentials, what we call cracks, are, and look at the economics of each project based on those assumptions.
Does the fact that we have an export ban increase or reduce the uncertainty that you'll see a return on refinery investment?
I think what the industry needs is certainty on what the legislative outlook is going to be. The problem is uncertainty.
And Mr. Drevna?
Yeah, I mean, we do, as most industries in this country, do a really good job of handling economic uncertainty. What we don't do a good job and can't do a good job is handling regulatory and legislative uncertainty, because that just creates paralysis.
So some order of predictability as to what that operating climate is important.
Absolutely, because as Dr. Burnett mentioned, these investments aren't made on a 2 or 3 year basis or on an election cycle basis. They're made on a long-term basis.
And if a low oil price sends a signal to slow production of domestic oil, what is the problem with doing that from a national perspective? Anyone?
Yes. Sorry. We actually gave an exhibit to our testimony that we filed last Friday by PIRA, and it shows a wide range of prices from $40 up to about $100 and the effect of $10 swings. And $10 swings is the difference between 2 million barrel a day loss in this country or a 2 million barrel a day gain. So it's a great supply. It's a great chart to look at. That's filed in our testimony.
Does anyone else have a comment on any of that? Dr. Burnett?
Yeah, I think that I need to go back and say that if you lift the ban right now, the effect on the global supply and demand really is a zero-sum game, because you export more, but you'll be importing more. So the issue is, when's the demand side going to pick up enough to support prices and enable domestic production to increase again? And so we're looking at, you have to look at the GDP, the world growth in GDP over the next few years to make that determination.
Thank you so much. I see my time is up, so I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You caught me off guard there for a second. Let me move my chair. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Mr. Chairman, before I get started with my questions, I'd like to ask that a letter from the Ohio Oil and Gas Association expressing their members' support for lifting the crude export ban be submitted for the record.
Without objection, so submitted.
Gentlemen, as you know, I live in energy-rich eastern and southeastern Ohio. You've all heard of the Marcellus and the Utica Shale. You can't turn a corner there without seeing the renaissance in energy production. As you know, we've passed a bill here in the House dealing with streamlining and quickening the liquid natural gas export permitting process. I'd like to hear from each of you what are the most significant differences, both pro and con, domestic and geopolitical, to LNG exports versus crude exports. The folks back at home where we have a wealth of that resource, both of them, would like to know. And we'll just start down at the end. Sir, if you would like to take a first crack at it.
Sure. Probably the most important thing in looking at the future prospects for LNG exports is what the price of oil is going to be, because internationally, the reason the U.S. can export LNG into the global markets is we had a big spread between the U.S. price of natural gas and the world price of natural gas, because in most places outside of the United States, natural gas prices are tied contractually to oil prices. So as oil prices came down or have come down, that is actually going to put some pressure on the idea of exporting LNG from the U.S. So it would make it less profitable to do that.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Johnson, we both have ample supplies of both, of natural gas. We have too much of it in this country now. We have 150, 200-year supply of natural gas, and we got a long supply now, finding over 100 billion barrels of recoverable oil in several key fields, in addition to the liquid-rich plays in the Utica and the Marcellus, which is where people are focused. We need to lift the ban on oil. We need to be able to export and expedite LNG. So both, there is plenty. Europe needs it. The rest of the world, Japan, South Korea, they all need it. How can you ask Japan and South Korea not to take Iranian crude when we will not export them oil? Europe is taking 40% of their needs from Russia, oil. They need exports from the U.S. in addition to LNG.
Okay. Thank you. Sir?
Congressman, it's interesting because, when you look at the LNG, we have an abundance, we have more than we need, and, Congress, this body did the right thing in passing the legislation to export it. We're still in that, maybe we're here, maybe we're there stage. Mr. Sheffield mentioned we've got a lot, but do we have a lot right now, and how long would that last? You have to look at the oil export, and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't export. I'm saying just look at everything in total. The world supply, it comes. It's a big barrel, and everybody takes what they want. The more we produce here, the less we have to export. That's going to have that will have an impact on prices. Just like the shale boom has already had an impact on global prices. Imagine what prices would be today, and I'm not the fortune teller, but imagine what prices would be today if we hadn't had the entrepreneurs like Mr. Sheffield and his company to get this stuff to market. With all the stuff that's going on in the global market, if we would still be 40, 50, 60%. So we've had an impact on global prices. Okay. One thing we're saying is let's do it the right way.
Okay. Mr. Kingston.
Two things. One area where I see a big difference is that Allowing crude exports would affect an international benchmark, Brent, to which we are tied because our gasoline market is ultimately tied to Brent. It would work to probably push down the Brent price. Therefore, there's a benefit to us. In the case of LNG, you're not going to be pushing down you would be pushing down an international benchmark that doesn't affect us. As Mr. Szymanski noted, there are other prices out there; they'd be affected. Our Henry Hub price would probably rise. But I think where it's a benefit to the U.S. is I get very concerned about the problem of stranded gas, where the U.S. just simply has so much gas that you start to see a rollback in production, you start to see wells shut in, you start to see workers go somewhere else, and you just need that safety valve to make sure that industry can keep running.
Okay. Ms. Jaffe.
So I agree with what Mr. Kingston said, but I would add the following thing. I mean, and I respect the other panelists who have made this point. We're really arguing about who gets the margin. Right? We're not really arguing about if you put a lot of gasoline in the market, that eventually lowers the price that refiners in other locations can pay for crude oil. It eventually brings the price down. So either way, when you're having oil exit the United States in any form, it'll eventually bring the price down. So we're arguing about who gets the margin. And what I would say to you, and it would take a careful study, is that if a refinery operates at 88% of capacity or 85% of capacity, that doesn't affect how many people get employed there. If Mr. Sheffield lays off 100 rigs, a lot of people lose their jobs.
Ms. Jaffe, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I know I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Markle and Dr. Burns respond to this? Can you indulge me?
Without objection.
Mr. Markle.
So the big difference is that in crude oil, there's a lot of downstream processing and a lot of jobs, and with all due respect, it's not just about the margins, it's about who gets the paycheck, how much overtime they get, and ultimately how many people are employed. With LNG, there's minimal downstream processing, minimal downstream jobs. We're not importing it, and from our point of view, we're looking for a price that's somewhere in the middle where we can keep the manufacturing competitiveness that we have, but certainly we've got a lot of stranded gas, and we need to find a way to build the pipelines to get it out.
Thanks, Mr. Markle. Dr. Burns?
I think there are two major differences between crude and LNG. One is, as you've heard, LNG is a real excess in the U.S. Crude oil is not. We're still importing 33%. The other major difference is that LNG is sold into an absolutely free, open market. Crude is still controlled by OPEC. Whether you like it or not, they still can impact the price up or down. So there are two major differences.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our panel that's in front of us today, because this is a very important topic, something that probably we should have discussed a few years back, but for Congress's point of view, we're right on time. I want to talk to Mr. Burnett for just a second. I'm kind of confused here why you'd be so worried about our crude oil exports when apparently you're not too worried about exporting gas and diesel. When we're talking about you thinking the prices are going to go up, we haven't seen that happen while your company, I'm assuming, as you said a while ago when Mr. Flores was talking to you, that you export oil and diesel, don't you?
Okay, the issue is that if you lift the export ban, you're going to enable European refiners who are currently struggling to have a more sustained life.
So can your company not compete with them?
And the problem is that we cannot compete with them because they can buy their crude oil, U.S. crude oil, cheaper than I can in Trainer. They can then refine it and send it back to the Northeast cheaper than we can make it because of freight rates. So they can put us out of.
Well, we're not hearing that from the other refineries. I mean,
yes,
your other companies. There's other refineries that actually support this. So I'm saying that your company can't compete with them.
The people that are supporting this are probably integrated oil companies. All of the independent merchant refiners like ours are part of the crude coalition, are against crude export.
Are you not buying that same crude to be able to produce gasoline and diesel?
We're buying domestic crude.
Are you not able to compete with those refineries at that time?
I'm sorry?
I mean, are you not able to compete with your oil and gas, your diesel and gasoline?
What you've heard, I think, repeatedly is that product prices on the Northeast are set by Brent price.
Sure.
And so the European refiners are selling gasoline and diesel at a Brent price, but they can export it to the Northeast lower than we can produce it because of freight rates.
Well, I guess I'm just not quite wrapping my head around it just yet. Hopefully I will, because to me it's kind of contradicting yourself. And I mean, I appreciate business. The last thing I want to do is put any businesses out of business, but you have 400 jobs and we have roughly 350,000 jobs, using a rough figure, that supports the idea of bringing that crude oil to you to begin with. And I think your company could possibly, I'm not in the business, but could compete maybe without having to be, and just indulge me here for a second, and I don't mean to be frank, but it almost sounds a little bit selfish.
We want to compete on a level playing field. By lifting the export bans without dealing with other issues, it makes us uncompetitive.
Well, I obviously don't know your business as well as you do, but there's other refineries that are saying they can't compete with it. Mr. Sheffield, can you enlighten me a little bit? You talked about the storage capacity and the buildup, about the capacity running out. Can you expand on that?
Yes, Cushing storage, I know Amy Jaffe said it's around 50 million barrels. It's at an all-time high. There's recent pipelines installed by Enbridge called the Flanagan South, and that is bringing a lot of oil down from Canada. So at the same time, our sweet crude from our shell plays, some in Oklahoma, the Scoop play, and also the Mississippi Lime play, everything, Niobrara play, the Bakken play, they're all moving toward Cushing before it gets to the Gulf Coast. So storage is at a high. I know the Plains All-American CEO, Mr. Armstrong, he stated that we have about 60 to 90 days of storage left at Cushing. Gulf Coast, Pad 3, what we call Pad 3, it's filling up too. It's over 210 million barrels, and it could be filled up shortly also over the next several weeks. So it's a big issue. It's what Turner Mason says, the wall is coming, and it's coming faster. And that's why we have wide crude prices today. So
if we were to lift exports, you would feel like there'd be a little bit more stability in the markets, not necessarily being able to, I'm switching gears with you and going from capacity to, or storage capacity to stabilizing the market, where it's a big swing that we see right now in the prices. I mean, they'll jump up $10 and they'll go down $10. Do you think if we were to be able to control our own destiny by having the exports out, by being able to compete and have a competitor against OPEC, would we be able to see more stability come into the market?
Yes, like I said, $10 swing, we would put more rigs to work. I know 7,000 other independents would put more rigs to work. They would do it in Oklahoma. That would help stabilize U.S. production and actually increase it over the next several years. OPEC loves the fact that we have an export ban, I promise you. We're playing right into their strategy.
Thank you. My time is out. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for bearing with us today. Mr. Burnett, you said that you want the ban on crude oil exports, but not on condensate, not on other products you produce, right?
That's not quite what I said.
All right.
Crude oil.
Crude oil, right. Now, you also sell, Delta sells airplane tickets. Should we put an export ban on not allowing foreigners to purchase airplane tickets? Because that would help consumers too, because American consumers have that empty seat out there. There'd be less competition for the seat, the price would be lower, right? It'd be good.
We want an open playing field, both in refining and in airline.
Right. What you really want is you want the things you sell to be available to be sold in the marketplace at the highest price you can get, and the things that you purchase to be price controlled. That's what you've really advocated for here today. And I've heard lots of different comments. Mr. McNerney said $50 is pretty low for crude. Mr. Drebner, you said you're not a fortune teller. I've got reports from Goldman Sachs, not 24 months old, that said crude's going to be at $200 a barrel. Truth is, we have no idea. None of us, collectively. And we shouldn't worry about that. It shouldn't trouble us that we don't know. Mr. Margaret, you said we got to keep the price in the middle. The middle of what? I mean, that's not a question. That's rhetorical. I do have a question for you. I do have a question for you, though.
LNG, not crude.
So where should we keep crude oil prices? High or low? You want middle for LNG. Where do you want crude oil prices?
I don't have an opinion on where crude should be.
Yeah, none of us should have an opinion. This is the unstated joke from so much of what I've heard from
the consumer benefits
folks.
and the boost to our economy of low oil prices. Is
maybe that's right. Goldman now thinks oil might go to $20 a barrel. By the way, These are smart people who are putting their own money at risk, which is very different than us. We're putting everyone else's money at risk. The person who has the best idea, chance to get it right is them, and they're just wrong a lot. And that's okay. That doesn't trouble me, but we shouldn't put a set of policies in place that feign any knowledge on our part about what's really going to go on. Let's go the other way. Mr. Sheffield, your export product is price control. We have an export ban, right? It's a price control. Would you agree? Crude, right?
Yes,
we
crude.
can't export. It's a ban. It's a price control. Your inputs, steel, labor, all kinds of chemicals that you use, are any of those price controlled? Or are you subject to market forces? You have to compete globally to purchase your inputs.
It's market forces. What's interesting by the comments about from the laborers is that we've added over 2 million jobs over the last several years with the shale boom. And a lot of that is in the steel industry, too.
You bet. Union employees, right?
Yes.
And the steel industry. Good union workers getting paid good salaries. Yeah. No, I think that's right. Mr. Sheffield, you had a chart, and I want to make sure I understood it. You had a chart that I think disagreed with what Mr. Markle said. He said that this oil will be produced anyway, right? The idea was, even if we leave the ban in place, you're going to go ahead and produce this crude. And your chart seems to suggest otherwise, and I'm just trying to reconcile these two ideas.
Yes, this is from a group Power out of New York. At roughly $50 a barrel, we'll lose about 2.5 million barrels a day. And so what's going to happen? They're not going to get it from us. They're going to get it from Saudi Arabia, Iran, if they can, or other countries in North Africa. That's what they're going to import it again.
Appreciate that. Mr. Drevny, you said in your testimony, if we were to move forward with lifting the export ban, that your organization would want to see other anti-free market policies addressed at the same time. You mentioned RFS. You talked a little bit about the Jones Act. I assume it's the case that if we got to the Jones Act and we got to RFS, you'd be thrilled to see the crude oil export ban lifted as well.
Congressman, as I said, we're basically free marketers. As a matter of fact, if I look up and down the panel, we're probably the most free marketers sitting here. Because
you're not including up this direction.
We want no. We want a free market and a level playing field for all U.S. industries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now you're back.
Gentleman yields back. This time, recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that very much. In January, the Department of the Interior released a draft offshore leasing plan covering 2017 to 2022, which proposed opening part of the Atlantic, including areas off the coast of Virginia, my home state. Although I represent the mountains and the cold territory and don't have the coast, I do obviously care about what happens in Virginia very much, and they would open that up for oil and gas leasing. Mr. Sminsky, I would have to ask, they made it 50 miles off the shore of the coast. DOD had some concerns there, and I'm just curious, does your organization have any idea of whether or not DOD's had problems in the Gulf of Mexico dealing with oil exploration or natural gas exploration?
Well, I'm from the Department of Energy.
I understand.
So, the opening of those leases, I mean, I think that we're now seeing production rising in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's, in the aftermath of the Macondo spill. I think the issues associated with offshore leasing tend to be environmentally oriented. There are some people that are concerned about the impacts on water and the environment and generally climate.
And generally, we believe if you open up the Mid-Atlantic, you would agree that the data indicates that there's an abundant energy source out there, even though we don't have any recent data.
From time to time, EIA has looked at what the resource base is around the United States, and there's a possibility that there are both oil and gas resources in the Mid-Atlantic.
And the last time any real research was done was back, I believe, about 1980. And it takes about 10 years to go from start to finish, and we're just now getting started, but we're 50 miles out, which would be better, I think, if we were closer in. I find that interesting, and you all wouldn't have any way of knowing this, but I voted on my first resolution as a member of the Virginia legislature in 2004 requesting that we go down this road. And am I not correct that it takes about 10 years to go from start to finish, and that if we had started in 2004 when the legislature first
in the offshore area, that's very typical.
And so if we'd started then, we would already be seeing both tax revenues and jobs and all kinds of things in the eastern part of the state. Wouldn't that be accurate?
I think the first thing that would happen is we probably end up updating all of that geologic information with modern 3D seismic technology and that kind of thing. So the upfront part is actually spending money. Now, there are jobs associated with that. Whether the revenues come in depends on what you find and how quickly you can produce it.
But there's a pretty good indication that we've got a fair amount of natural gas and at least a little bit of oil. Isn't that even based on the older technologies that showed up, did it not?
Yes, I mean, we know that there's oil and gas in eastern Canada, and those trends tend to move right down the coast.
And the Canadians are already, they've already got their straw dipped into that pool, don't they?
That is correct.
Yeah. So one might argue that the Canadians are getting fuel out of that source and selling it back. It might actually be flowing up to Canada from.
Well, it's a pretty long way from the Maritimes,
a long way.
Virginia.
I agree. I agree.
That would be a big straw.
I just want to see my folks getting some advantage out of all this. I'll open this up for anybody who wants to take it. I think I already know the answer, but if the United States is getting more oil and more natural gas, what impact would that have on, say, Russia, Iran, ISIS, even China? Who wants to take that? You want that?
My microphone is turned on. I usually try to avoid answering questions, but let me comment that when you listen to the panel here, Congressman Griffith, I think that more production on the market, regardless of its source, is going to tend to lower prices and benefit consumers. So that's true whether it's natural gas or oil or airline tickets. I mean, the more that you can put out there, the better off consumers are.
But when a country is basing a big part of its liquidity on energy, and all of a sudden a new giant rises up or gets extra strength, that in essence would mean that at least for the Chinese, the Russians, and maybe even ISIS, that it will negatively impact their ability to do things that we might be opposed to. Would you not agree?
It's certainly, I mean, one of the factors that's out there. One of the, very quickly, on looking at the time, this question of why there's this wide range of views of oil prices, whether it's $20 or $30 or $100 and over. A lot of that has to do with not being able to pin down answers to many of these geopolitical questions. Is Venezuela going to have a problem in the near term producing their 2 million barrels a day of oil? What about Iraq and because of ISIS? What about production outages in places like Libya? And then on the downside, it's things like the economy in China and whether or not Libya is going to return to the market. And it's true, nobody has the answer. It's not EIA doesn't have the answers to that.
Nobody does.
Nobody has the answers.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, indulge, but aren't we better off if the United States is controlling more of that by having more production? Because then if the Venezuelans do something or if there's a problem somewhere else, at least our own internal economy is not negatively impacted as much. And aren't we in a much better position today than we were just 5 years ago? And hopefully we'll be in an even better position 10 years from now.
I suspect that everybody on this panel would agree with you.
And I would say to you that when this first started, our new boom in energy, which we can continue to use, particularly if we open up the Mid-Atlantic and keep looking for ways to do this, I used to feel that maybe my children wouldn't have the economy that we had. Now I believe if we don't screw it up here in Washington, our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren can live in a United States where we are still the #1 economic nation in the world. With that, I yield back.
Can I just add one thing? I just want to separate one country that you mentioned. This is a benefit to China. I mean, you mentioned Russia, Iran, ISIS. This hurts. This helps China. Huge net importer.
Okay.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here and taking time to discuss what's a very important issue. And if I may, Mr. Drebna, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions in the time that I have, since Mr. Griffith used up most of my time.
I'm sorry.
Hey, do you need some more time? That's it. First of all, I want to say, we appreciate each of you being present, but particularly Mr. Drebna, I thank you that you're here to share AFPM's insight on this issue. I'd like to focus my time on your testimony. In your written statement, you noted that your organization is not opposed to lifting the ban on crude exports, but you mentioned two public policies, two areas in particular that should be considered during this debate. So I'd like for you to elaborate a little bit more on the RFS and the Jones Act and how they're related in this debate on the crude oil export ban.
Well, thank you. And I only got 5 minutes to elaborate on the RFS. As the chairman can attest to, it's probably not enough time. But in any event, we have, if you're going to talk about a free and open market, if you're going to talk about consumer protection and consumer choice, if you're going to talk about getting the economy moving, we have the RFS, as I said in my testimony and my written statement and my oral testimony, in 7 short years it's become an anachronism. All the assumptions that were made back in the day where the ESA 07 was passed, where EIA had gasoline demand going through the roof, and that's plummeted some 43% over those years, where we have a volumetric and not a percentage basis that we have to, 36 billion gallons, where the impact, where the thought was where we were going to, eliminate or reduce foreign energy sources. We're doing that because of companies like Mr. Sheffield. It's not because we're producing ethanol. Matter of fact, we're producing ethanol and we're exporting some, and we're importing it. What's the point? The environmental benefits have shown to be, if not negligible, negative. So it's time to look at that because it's not a free market. Let the consumer decide. Do they want more ethanol or more biodiesel in their gas tank, or they don't? On the Jones Act, and again, this is a whose ox is going to be gored is what you have to decide. If you lift the ban today without looking at the Jones Act, it's not going to be it'll be a zero-sum game. There'll probably be some job gains on this side. There will be job losses on the other side. That's a fact. So at least know the facts before you make the decision. And that's all we're asking. Again, we're not opposed to it, but for energy security, national security, let's do it all. Let's have all the above, and not what we have now is all the above and none of the below, or very little of the below. So that's basically what we're trying to say, Congressman.
Thank you very much, and out of mercy, I will yield back. How's that?
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes the questions. Once again, I want to thank the panel of witnesses. We do appreciate your insights, and this is an interesting question, and certainly with the changes taking place, we want to look at it thoroughly. So we may be calling you again very soon. We'll keep the record open for 10 days, and that will adjourn today's hearing, and thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you, Jerry.
So will you.